open up the webinar and we'll be live. Here we go. And we're live. Welcome, everyone. Hello. Welcome. Hello, hello. We're going to get started in just a moment. And let some more folks fill up the room. It's nice to be here. This is my first Zoom since the new year, it feels like. And I had been doing them pretty nightly. I'm Anissa, by the way. I'm putting in the link to tonight's document, which will have links to our presenters, to our partners, to library news and information, and anything comes up, we can add that. All right, we're going to fill it up, fill it 7 o'clock. And yes, you can let us know where you're joining us from. We always like that. And if you know what territory you're joining us from, you can tell us about that as well. And I'll add a link to a great map you can use to find out. So tonight we are here for part of our More Than a Month celebration. More Than a Month San Francisco Public Library is our Black History Month celebration. And we started in mid-January and run it through February. But we are also now doing programming all year round, really thoughtfully and with effort. So while we do celebrate Black History Month during Black History Month, we're going to really be trying to program all year round, celebrating all of our heritage in San Francisco and the Bay Area. So please look forward for More Than a Month all year round. And tonight we have our soulmates of the natural world, NPS, joining us today for a nature boost, which is a continued series. And they're going to be talking to us tonight about the Buffalo Soldiers. But first, I'm going to give you a bunch of library news, and I'm going to try and make it fast. Except for this part, not fast. The San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribal people, who are the original inhabitants of our peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland, and as uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. I really like to shout out the Segura Tay Lion Trust when I bring this up. They're a great women-led organization out of the East Bay, and they're going to actually be joining us in April for an in-person hybrid Zoom program, so please look forward to that. And later on, I'll also put in a link to a great reading list about Ohlonies and about other indigenous culture and here in the Bay Area. So like I said, you can list what territory you're joining us from today. You can check us out for all the rest of the More Than a Month events we have going on. We also have a reading campaign called On the Same Page. This Thursday, Alyssa Cole will be in person at the main library in the African American Center. We haven't had too many in-person events, but we are starting, and we're so excited that Alyssa is joining us all the way from Florida to do this. So come out and be there, but we understand if you can't, it's also going to be streaming. And then I'm just going to tell you about some other nature type stuff going on, but we do have a lot, so always check us out, sfpl.org/events. Our next Nature Boost is for Climate Action Month in April, Forest Health and Resilience in Marin. And we have Earth Day special with the amazing Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens, who will be doing an Earth Day Eco-Sex Walk for the second year in a row, starting at the Bernal Heights branch and going up to Holly Park. It is fun, it's performance, it's outside, and it's fun. Night of Ideas, March 4th. If you haven't heard about it, check it out. Come after hours event at the library, 7 to 1 a.m. So many different things happening on every single floor, food, drinks, dancing, flying people. Really, it's insane and amazing. Night of Ideas coming up. All right, that's all. That's all I'm going to talk about. But I do want to thank again our presenters tonight. We have Golden Gate National Recreation Area Park Rangers, Adrian, Cristina, and Sherry, and they're going to tell us about the Buffalo Soldiers. and they always come with the best, most informational info. And there will be time for Q&A. You can either put in the question and answer, or the chat is open. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over. Sherry, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and want to thank Anissa and all the folks at the San Francisco Public Library for allowing us to, share a little presentation today on the Buffalo Soldiers. Before I get started, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. So I'm Sherry Guillen. I use she, her, pronouns, and I am the Fort Point Education Program Manager.
Hi there, and I'm Adrian Boone. I work at Muir Woods National Monument. I work as a park ranger and I work as the volunteer coordinator.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cristina Martinez. I use she, her, pronouns as well. And I am the education programs manager for the Presidio and Crissy Field area of Golden Gate National Recreation Area.
And so I'm just going to pull up my screen very quickly. And as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the Buffalo Soldiers. And so with this being Black History Month, we really felt it was important to highlight the story of African Americans at Golden Gate National Recreation Area. And so we decided to do this kind of looking through the lens of the theme of Black History Month this year, which is Black resistance. And so what we're going to be looking at today is the ways in which African Americans have resisted historic and ongoing oppression and have advocated for sort of a dignified and self-determined life for themselves. And so with that, just a little bit about us. We all work at Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which hopefully many of you have been to, but if not, just a little background is, the park welcomes over 15 million visitors a year across more than 82,000 acres of coastal and urban lands. And this is north and south of the Golden Gate Bridge. And so it includes sites such as Alcatraz Island, Crissy Field, the Marin Headlands, the Presidio of San Francisco, Rancho Corral de Tierra, and Muir Woods National Monument. And so those are just some of the sites that are kind of under the Golden Gate National Recreation Area umbrella. And so we do also want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Coast Miwok and the Ramaytush Ohlone. And so the Presidio, Crissy Field, and other sites of Golden Gate National Recreation Area within the city of San Francisco lie in the ancestral homeland of the Coast Miwok and Ramaytush Ohlone, the original caretakers of this land. The Ramaytush and the Coast Miwok, they lived in harmony with this special place for thousands of years, managing its natural bounty for food, medicine, and other resources. And so we pay our respect to Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, and we aspire to uphold our responsibility to steward this land as the Coast Miwok and Ramaytush have done for centuries. And so with that, we kind of want to start off before diving into the Buffalo Soldiers history and talk about the sort of the past of African Americans' participation in early American history. And so I would like to just take a second for everyone to maybe take a look at this painting and maybe share in the chat what you see here. Does anything stand out to you? What are some thoughts that you have when you see this painting? And Adrian, if you don't mind maybe sharing anything that comes through in the chat.
Sure. And somebody asked if we could speak a little slower to all of us. So I'll try to speak a little slower myself. Someone says, all white men. That's what I said when we practiced earlier. That's the first thing I said. So somebody got it. Patricia. Oh, louder. Hey, Patricia. Trisha, I know you. 10 points. Oh, someone saw the black soldier behind. I still haven't found that black soldier. Patricia, you get another 10 points. Oh, wait. I don't know if that was, that's Zane. L. Zane, sorry. Take those 10 points away. Someone said looks either French and Indian War. Somebody else saw the black man behind with the musket. Someone said Revolution War scene.
Exactly. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. And so, what you see being depicted here is actually the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so, for those of you who might not be familiar, the Battle of Bunker Hill, this is one of the first major battles of the American Revolution. And to me, this painting really kind of illustrates sort of the image that most people have when they think of the American Revolution. They think of, white men fighting, and you don't really hear about the participation of people of color who were also in the military at the time. And so in the corner, as someone pointed out, there is a person of color. And so just to shed some light on that, there were about 5,000, estimated 5,000 African Americans who fought on the side of the Patriots, and there were also people who fought on the side of the Loyalists, or those who were fighting for the British. Now, everyone's had maybe different motivations for joining. So some people, they may have joined to sort of pursue their own freedom. So many people who actually joined the British side of fighting, they were promised their freedom in exchange for their service. And it also kind of happened on the other side. So many people in the North, they had enslaved people. And so some people were actually forced into service, or they were promised by their enslavers that they would be that they would receive freedom in return for their service. And so this is kind of one of the places where we start to see, again, the military being used as a form of resistance by not only African Americans, but also Indigenous people as well. But also, like you see in this painting, their participation in our early military history is often overlooked. And so I just wanted to highlight the story of one soldier that we know of, who is Salem Poor, and he was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was actually singled out for his service specifically because he had fought with honor and with courage and bravery, and he was actually one of the only people to be singled out. But again, this is something that isn't really taught in the dominant narrative, and so we thought it was important to share that this participation of Africans in the military is not anything new. It goes back to the founding of our country. And so African Americans, they are going to continue to serve in the military. They're going to serve in the War of 1812 and again in the American Revolution. But once you get to the Civil War, initially only white men are allowed to enlist. And that's going to be the case up until 1863, when you have the Emancipation Proclamation that is signed by President Lincoln. And so what this document is going to do is it is going to not only free the enslaved people who are living in the rebelling states, but it is also going to allow to, it's going to open the doors of the military to African-American men, which again, at the start of the war, they had not been allowed to do. So they are allowed to enlist, but they are going to have to serve in segregated units. And so there's a few reasons for that. Mainly, there's a lot of sort of racist ideas of the time, sort of doubting the abilities of Black men to serve as soldiers. And so there sometimes are, fears by people that are thinking, what's going to happen if we give African-American men weapons? Or are they actually going to be courageous enough to fight in these battles? Or are they going to run away on the battlefield? Even though, as you look at history, that Black men have been proving themselves as soldiers since the beginning. But again, these are ideas that are going on at the time. And so they're going to face a lot of challenges along with this sort of general sense of doubt that is doubting the abilities of Black men to serve as soldiers. But despite of that, they are going to still join the military. And so here I just kind of want to open it up and see if anyone has any thoughts or ideas on why these men might have joined the military despite all these obstacles and challenges.
Okay, I got hope for their freedom, and someone else said freedom.
Yes, absolutely. So there were people who were fighting not just for maybe their own freedom, but the freedom of all people who were enslaved. And so you're going to see that there were also a lot of free Black men who decided to join the military. And so they were already free. But again, wanting to expand that idea of freedom to other people and not just themselves. And so another big motivator on top of the pay and on top of possibly other opportunities. One big factor that's going to come in for people is that this is possibly a path to full citizenship. And so you see this echoed by Frederick Douglass, who actually served as a recruiter and enlisted 2 of his own sons into the military. And so what he says is, once let the Black man get upon his person the brass letter US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. And so even though there are a lot of Black people who are living free, that does not mean that they are being treated as equal citizens. In fact, they are really sort of given kind of a second-class citizenship. And so a lot of people also see this possibly as an opportunity to, again, earn equal citizenship. And so one of the first units that's going to be recruited and organized is going to be one in the north, which is the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And so this is actually going to be made up of mostly freed Black men who are coming from all over the country to form this regiment. And the recruitments are going to be so successful that they are actually able to form another regiment. So they form the 55th Regiment, and as well as a cavalry regiment as well. And so I just want to point out this recruitment poster that you see here. And so you see that they are being offered a bounty of $100. They're being offered the pay of $13 a month, which was the same that white soldiers were receiving at the time. They're also being promised good food and clothing and state aid to their families. However, even though they are being promised the pay of $13 a month, what is actually going to happen is when it comes time to being paid, they're instead only going to be paid $10 a month. And on top of that, they also have to pay for their uniforms, which is something that white soldiers did not have to do. And so rather than just accept this lesser pay, what the men of the 54th decide to do is they're actually going to boycott. And so they go without any pay for 18 months because, again, they want what was promised to them. And in that time, the governor of Massachusetts actually offers to make up the difference and to pay them, but they refuse because it was the federal government that promised them that pay of $13 a month. And so it's not until June of 1864 when Congress finally authorizes that equal pay. But again, this was another form of resistance that you see within the military. And so then here on the right, you see a picture of a camp. And so the men of the 54th, they had to, again, knowing that all eyes are kind of on them and there is so much doubt on this regiment, they're really seen as sort of a trial experiment. And so because of this, the men know that they really have to sort of set themselves to a higher standard. And so they are going to drill harder, they are going to march harder than any other regiments at the time, just because they know that they have to be, in a sense, perfect. And so that is what they're going to be doing. And when they finally get their opportunity to, when they are actually deployed south, they're going to find themselves mostly tasked with manual labor initially. And so when they first arrive in South Carolina, they are mostly going to be digging trenches, they're going to be building fortifications. They're not actually getting an opportunity to prove themselves as soldiers, but that is going to change with one of their most famous battles, which is the Battle of Fort Wagner. And so this is going to take place in July 18th of 1863. And this was a frontal attack that was part of a strategy to try and take Fort Wagner, which was a fortification, a Confederate fortification that was protecting the city of Charleston and was seen as a really strategic place to try and take for the Union. But unfortunately, this is something that is not going to be successful. And out of the 600 men that take part in this battle, over 200 are going to end up killed, wounded, missing, or captured. And so they do end up losing this battle. But the bravery and the courage that they display here is really going to help shift public opinion on the values of Black soldiers. And so This is really going to help inspire the enlistment of over 180,000 Black soldiers by the end of the Civil War, and is really going to sort of mark like a turning point in the war. And so after the war, you see that the memory of the 54th is not forgotten. And so there's going to be efforts to create a memorial to them. And so this memorial is one in Boston. It is also actually a National Historic Site. So this is Boston African American National Historic Site. And this memorial is seen really as sort of a kind of a groundbreaking moment, because this was unveiled in 1897. This was a time when minstrel shows were popular, racist sort of caricatures were prevalent at the time. And so this was really one of the first times that you see African Americans being depicted in a respectful, realistic, and honorable way. And so the 54th definitely kind of set the precedent for Black soldiers in the future. And so this brings us to the Buffalo Soldiers. And so I found like an interesting little connection. On the left here, you see a drummer. And so that was a drummer of the 54th Massachusetts, whose name is Miles Moore. He's about 15 years old when he joins the 54th. And he is actually going to go on to become a Buffalo Soldier. And so who were the Buffalo Soldiers? Well, in 1866, after the war, the Army is going to be more focused on sort of rebuilding the country after the war. And they're also going to be focused on expanding that Western frontier. And so they need people out there to participate in what they call the Indian Wars. And so they are going to form 6 Black regiments, 2 cavalry regiments, and 4 infantry regiments. And in 1869, they're going to merge a few of those. And so the 9th and the 10th cavalry, those are going to stay the same. The 38th and the 41st are going to be merged into the 24th infantry. And the 39th and 40th are going to be merged into the 25th infantry. And so just a little background about like where the name comes from. Well, there's a few different theories on why they were called the Buffalo Soldiers. So one of the theories is that when Indigenous people saw the Buffalo Soldiers, that they thought that their dark curly hair reminded them of, the fur of a buffalo. There's also a belief that because some of the men wore buffalo robes, which you can see in this photo here, that maybe that's why they were called the Buffalo Soldiers. And then there's also another theory that believes that the fighting spirit of these men reminded Indigenous people of the buffalo. And so it was sort of like a warrior kind of spirit. And so those are, again, just some of the ideas of where the nickname came from. And it was something that the Buffalo Soldiers really sort of embraced and kind of became a name for all of them. So I'm going to pass it over to, and then just to give you a scope of where the Buffalo Soldiers were. So as I mentioned, they were tasked really with sort of working out on that Western frontier. And so these are all sites that are associated with the Buffalo Soldiers. And it really kind of goes beyond this as well, outside of the country. But these are some of the sites that are associated with them. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about some of those sites. And I'm going to pass it over to Ranger Cristina to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Sherry. So as you notice on that map, which shows the National Park Service sites that have history associated with the Buffalo Soldiers, a lot of those sites are concentrated in the Western United States. And that is for a really good reason. And that is because after the Civil War, that was considered a quote unquote peacetime period. So the US Army had different priorities during this time. The Buffalo Soldiers took on a variety of duties. They participated in different operations that really were reflecting the different priorities of the US Army post-Civil War. And although the U.S. Army and post-Civil War was considered a peacetime period, it definitely was very much the opposite of that, especially for Indigenous Americans, as during this time, manifest destiny ideology and westward expansion was resulting in the removal and violent genocide of Indigenous peoples. And as for that, the Buffalo Soldiers were part of the Indian Wars and other tasks that were quote unquote made to control Native American populations, especially in the plains. For instance, they were assigned to maintain order in El Paso, Texas, where Indigenous peoples were not content with living on reservations and were wanting to hold the government accountable for many failed promises after they were put on the reservation system. And like Sherry mentioned, right, their name Buffalo Soldiers stems from their interactions with Indigenous peoples in the plains, especially speaks to their participation in the Indian Wars. kind of a little bit of a note about that. Some sources, state that the Black regiments were assigned in the West to shield them from possible racial abuse as a result of the Civil War. However, many did believe that the fundamental reason was to sacrifice Black troops rather than white troops in the Indian Wars. And of course, the involvement in military actions against Indigenous people created a moral dilemma for these soldiers, pursuing one of the very few honorable careers available to them at this time, when they were also fighting for their own freedom, meant fighting other people of color at the hands of the US Army. I recommend you all to check out the website for the National Museum of African American History. They have a great page on the Buffalo Soldiers that also highlights this moral dilemma about the soldiers and poses the question, we honor those warriors, but what of the wars? In addition to participating in the Indian Wars and other actions against Indigenous peoples, Buffalo Soldiers also captured cattle rustlers, thieves. They protected settlers, mostly white settlers that were going out towards the westward expansion, protected stagecoaches, other property like wagon trains, and also railroad crews along the Western Front. They also partook in military operations abroad, and I'll be highlighting two of those in just a moment. But last but not least, they protected the country's first national parks. So we do like to call them the original park rangers. And in fact, the uniform that they wore, that 4-pinch hat, was inspiration to create the present day National Park Ranger uniform. Next slide. And so with all of these tasks, all of these duties, of course, no matter where these soldiers went, they still had to deal with discrimination, challenges based on the color of their skin. I'm going to read this quote from David Nevin, author of The Old West, The Soldiers. They fought frequently and hard, deserting far less often than whites and holding on to both discipline and morale during winter marches when white soldiers faltered. Yet they remained cordoned off in their own units, segregated from the rest of the army. And when they went into action, field dispatches mentioned them as having been merely engaged. White officers shunned duty with the Black regiments, regarding it as a form of exile. This quote just touches the surface on what the challenges and what these soldiers had to face, especially on the Western frontier. They had to deal with white officers that did not want to work with them because at this time period, Black men were not officers in the US Army. They were still segregated, even though they were accomplishing so many things in the name of the US Army. And of course, they had to face a lot of challenges. Next slide. Some of these other challenges, of course, consisted of receiving inferior supplies, food, and shelter compared to their white counterparts. They, of course, had to deal with derogatory names from their fellow white soldiers. And, especially in certain Western states like Texas, they suffered very severe prejudice. In fact, some of the regiments were repeatedly attacked in Rio Grande City, Brownsville, and even Houston. Next slide. And so the Buffalo Soldiers are having a lot of duties within continental United States. And during this quote unquote peacetime period, the US Army is not only focusing on aiding westward expansion, but they're also aiding US expansion abroad. So this painting here depicts Buffalo Soldier regiments charge up San Juan Hill, Cuba on July 1st, 1898. And this painting kind of highlights the part of the Spanish-American War that occurred. The war with Spain began in April of 1898 when Major General William Shafter, a former commander of the 24th Infantry, led an expedition force into Cuba. The Spanish-American War was actually the very first time Buffalo Soldiers were sent overseas. And although the Spanish-American War was fought to quote-unquote liberate the Caribbean and Philippines from Spanish colonial rule, the participation of African-American troops was actually pretty controversial in the African-American community. Next slide. Diverse opinions were shared in many Black editorials all over the country, highlighting how some troops and many citizens openly questioned whether African Americans should fight for a country where African Americans experienced institutionalized racism and terror, primarily in the southern states. It is also very important to note that by this time, by 1898, by the time the Spanish-American War began, Black troops made up about 20% of the United States cavalry. But yet, like I mentioned, it's still at this time period the U.S. Army did not want any Black officers during this war. So I kind of want to just highlight some of the editorials that were for or against the Buffalo Soldiers participating in these overseas operations. The Indianapolis Freeman published in 1898 against fighting. If the government wants our support and services, let us demand and get a guarantee for our safety and protection at home. When we are guaranteed freedom and equality before the law as other American citizens, then we will have the right as such to take up arms in defense of our country. Now, editorials for fighting, such as seen here on the Cleveland Gazette, published in March of 1898. Of all citizens, the Afro-American has the mighty interest at stake. Since our fondest and most cherished hopes for liberty and happiness are all centered in the institutions of our country, let us be ready and willing to do even more than others in the hour of our nation's peril. Thus shall be reaffirmed our claims to equal liberty and protection. And so you can see just from these two editorials with very different opinions, all of the conflict that was happening, not only within the larger African-American community, but also probably within the soldiers themselves. Other things that are notable about the Spanish-American War and the Buffalo Soldiers' involvement in this war is that in order to prepare for the invasion in Cuba, these soldiers had to be sent to the southeastern United States, where overt discrimination was the norm. The troops also had to deal with challenging tropical climate, muddy terrain, and yellow fever. In fact, during an outbreak of yellow fever, 24th Infantry soldiers served as nurses by orders of the U.S. Army. Also, these soldiers should not just be acknowledged for what they were ordered to do by the U.S. Army, but also by what they were not ordered to do. William H. Tompkins, who was a 10th Cavalry private, along with 3 others, volunteered. They were not ordered, but they volunteered to go ashore to rescue fellow U.S. soldiers and Cuban allies under the line of fire. Due to their actions, they were actually given and awarded the Medal of Honor. And this is one of the highest, honors that you can receive as a military person. And in fact, you can still honor William H. Tompkins today in the San Francisco National Cemetery, and you can actually see that on his grave, he will have engraved the Medal of Honor symbol, which tells us, that he's a Medal of Honor recipient and that he's definitely should be honored for that. Towards the end of the Spanish-American War, which was by 1899, about 18 Black soldiers had been awarded this very same Medal of Honor, which, like I mentioned, it is the nation's highest award for bravery and gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. Next slide. And so, like I mentioned, the Spanish-American War was the very first time Buffalo soldiers were going abroad, but that wasn't the last time. So after Spanish colonial rule was defeated through the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War in 1898. The Buffalo soldiers were also dispatched out to the Philippines. And this is a great photograph of some of the troops here in San Francisco in the year 1900, right before they went to the Philippines. So troops of all 4 regiments that were assigned to Pacific Commands, so whether it was during the Spanish-American War or the Philippine-American War, they actually departed and returned through San Francisco. However, the Army didn't station any of these units at the Presidio of San Francisco until 1899. That was in part because the Presidio was primarily a post for artillery units, but it was also because of the Army's reluctance to place Black soldiers in major cities where white citizens could cause friction. What ultimately brought these soldiers to the Presidio was this war, the Philippine-American War as well. And, even with this other operation, there were very similar sentiments within the Black community as to whether or not these soldiers should still be fighting wars abroad. Many of these sentiments, guided around whether, they should still be fighting in a country like the United States or whether they should even be fighting other people of color abroad. And even some of these quotes highlighted here on the screen highlights what some of the soldiers even felt, that inner conflict, which I can see as a form of resistance, right? You have an inner conflict of having these duties that you have to do as a soldier, but recognizing how this expansion into other countries like the Philippines is probably something that you wouldn't agree with. Commissary Sergeant Middleton W. Sadler of the 25th Infantry wrote this quote in a letter. "We are now arrayed to meet a common foe, men of our own hue and color. Whether it is right to reduce these people to submission is not a question for soldiers to decide. Our oaths of allegiance knows neither race, color, nor nation. Another soldier wrote, our racial sympathies will naturally be with the Filipinos. They are fighting manfully for what they conceive to be their best interests, but we cannot, for the sake of sentiment, turn our back upon our own country. And so, again, there was considerable opposition to U.S. intervention in the Philippines. In fact, many Black leaders and editorials expressed support for Filipino independence. During this Filipino-American War, one of the biggest challenges that the 24th and 25th Regiment initially encountered were the insurrectos, who were the Filipino nationalists who resisted the idea of American control over their, after Spanish colonial rule. So these insurrectos started attacking the 24th and 25th regiments. So shortly after, the 9th and 10th Cavalry were sent. So this meant that all 4 Black regiments were involved in the Philippine-American War. Something really interesting to note about the Buffalo Soldiers' experience in the Philippine-American War is that actually the insurrectos in their propaganda war, they actually used posters addressed to the colored American soldier. And in this propaganda, in these flyers, they reminded Black soldiers about the lynchings that were happening back in the United States. And they inevitably asked them to not serve the white imperialists against other people of color. And in fact, there were actually a few handful of Buffalo soldiers that did desert during this war. And there was one soldier in particular that defected to the other side and fought with the insurrectos in the name of freedom and true independence for the Filipinos against American rule. And so the fact that some of these soldiers deserted, I consider that also a form of resistance. And even though they may have taken an oath as a soldier, you have to remember probably the moral dilemma they were facing during this time period, at a time period when they were facing all the challenges back home. They were facing overt discrimination back in the United States, and they were fighting people that looked very much like them in the color of their skin. Next slide. And so, with that being said, I kind of wanted to highlight, some of their involvement in the Spanish and Philippine-American War. However, the Buffalo Soldiers did other things in the Pacific that did not necessarily have to do with battle. And with that, I will hand that over to Ranger Adrian.
All right. Thanks, Christina. Well, the Buffalo Soldiers legacy continues, and they also, they worked in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And we didn't mention it earlier, maybe we did, but a lot of these parks that we're talking about, we've worked in as park rangers. So this is a park I've worked at. But before that, there were about the 25th Infantry comprised of about 850 enlisted men and officers. They arrived in Honolulu in January 14th of 1913. They went to Schofield Barracks on Oahu. And the morning after their arrival, they began a 2-day, 23-mile march to Schofield Barracks, where they were stationed until 1917. They marched in downtown Honolulu. They competed in track and field, and they played in baseball games. Their team, the Wreckers, were a winning baseball team and were later published in the Honolulu newspaper. They later played in the Negro League, and one player, Wilbur Bullet Ellis, was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Next slide. So here's a picture of their baseball team, and they were perhaps best known for their baseball prowess. Stories about their winning baseball team, the Wreckers, were published in the Honolulu newspapers. Several team members, as I mentioned, later joined the Negro League. But despite, they were able to play in baseball, they still faced some discrimination. There were some newspaper articles that describe how the soldiers were viewed by Hawaii's multicultural society. Although they did not encounter the racial hatred they had from the communities on the mainland, they did not entirely escape prejudice here. The Black troops remained segregated from their white counterparts. Next slide, please. So they were summoned to help. They were on the island of Oahu. Their training at Schofield Barracks was spent marching and drilling, and it was both arduous and tedious. So when a chance for an assignment on Hawaii Island presented itself, which is also known as the Big Island, the company commanders jumped at it. They took a steamship over to the island of Hawaii and helped at the newly created Hawaiian Volcano Observatory on the Kilauea volcano. Dr. Jagger, who is the scientist in charge, wanted a trail up the largest volcano in the world, Mauna Loa, so he could take scientific measurements. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of Company B marching in Hilo, in the downtown Hilo. And between 1915 and 1917, 6 companies of the 25th Infantry were present in what is now Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. In that time, they assisted in investigations of a lava lake at Halemaumau crater on Kilauea. They were among the first soldiers to visit the Kilauea military camp and constructed the precursor to the modern day Mauna Loa Trail, which still exists today. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit in this section. Next slide. So they built a path up up the largest volcano in the world, which is called Mauna Loa. The path to Mauna Loa, explained by Dr. Jagger, was a vast desert waste without water and rising to an immense height. And every expedition to the summit exhausts the energies of the men and animals employed, and the animals are frequently crippled and have their legs cut through by the rough black lava. Consequently, the ranchers will not rent good animals at any price, and as there is no shelter on the summit, little water, no feed, violent winds, and low temperatures, the men who can with difficulty be induced to go and act as guides or packers object to remaining overnight. So the Buffalo Soldiers once again rose to the call of action when no other workers would ascend the mountain to build a trail in these difficult conditions. Next slide. So here's a picture of Mauna Loa volcano. It's the largest active volcano in the world. Dr. Jagger, his observatory was on the rim of the crater in the picture here. That's Halemaumau crater. At Kilauea is the volcano in the foreground, which is hard to tell it's a volcano. But he wanted an easier route to get up to the top of that trail. And there was a trail up to that mountain volcano. There's a trail called Ainapo, but it was a long trail and it took too long to get up. So there was also another man named Lauren Thurston, who is a businessman on Oahu and Honolulu. So he was the promoting of an idea of a national park at Kilauea volcano. And he saw a trail to Mauna Loa summit as an opportunity for expanded tourism. So the idea for Mauna Loa Trail was born. And this is the trail the Buffalo Soldiers built from Kilauea on the rim all the way to the summit of the volcano. Next slide. So under the headline, Soldiers Building Mountain Trail, the Maui News reported, Negro soldiers of the 25th Infantry to the number of 150 are at work constructing a trail from near the volcano house to the summit of Mauna Loa. It is estimated that 3 or 4 weeks will be devoted to this work. The soldiers are doing the work as a part of their vacation exercise. So once again, the soldiers aren't getting necessarily paid. They're on vacation leave. They took this steamer ship over to the Big Island, and they're basically volunteering to build this trail. The building the trail was incredibly hard work. The conditions were primitive, to say the least. Their only tools were 12-pound sledgehammers and gunny sacks. They worked in record-breaking rain and cold weather with very thin air and on difficult terrain over A'a, which is sharp, and lava rock, and Pohoihoi, which is the smooth rock. They camped in canvas tents, which did not offer much protection during the cold. They had rainy nights, and they did not have mules or horses to help with carrying the heavy loads. So next slide, please. So here's a picture of one of where it's thought their camps was up on Mauna Loa. It's a picture of so Captain Bates is one of the soldiers, and so it's called Camp Bates. And at Camp Bates, this is just a picture. There's no pictures of the Buffalo Soldiers building the trail, But this is an area where it's believed that Camp Bates was. This is an area where it's believed they camped up there. And looking down below, you can see the steaming, the steam coming out of the crater of Halemaumau down below. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of a Mauna Loa trail built by the Buffalo Soldiers. And this trail to this day leads hikers up to 2 backcountry cabins. So you can see the type of terrain you have to hike through. It's pretty devoid of plants and animals. Next slide. And the trail leads up. They built 30 miles total, but the first 10 miles takes you to, this is Red Hill Cabin. So after making it up the trail, you get to, there's a cabin. During the time of the building this, there wasn't a cabin at this place. There was a cave, and there's a cave that has a water tank. So they probably used the cave to get water, and they probably slept in tents. But this cabin was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. Next slide. Some of you may have heard of Mauna Loa in the news. It was in the news just last year. It erupted for the first time since 1984, and big eruptions and lots of lava comes out of this volcano. So once again, the Buffalo Soldiers fighting, for survival, resisting segregation, volunteered to build a trail on the world's largest active volcano. It didn't erupt while they were there, but they were building a trail on an active volcano. Is pretty amazing too. So yeah, it would have been neat to see this lava flow if they were there, but as long as it's not heading towards them, right? But the trail didn't get covered by this lava flow, which is a good thing. So one question, I guess, is could you guess why they volunteered to go to build the trail? That's kind of a fun question I'll throw at you guys. Next slide. So the soldiers helped Dr. Jagger take scientific measurements inside Kilauea's also a Halemaumau crater. And this talks about a half dozen of us dared the descent into Halemaumau crater and stood a few feet from the boiling torrent, oxidizing nickels in the cracks of the hardened lava. And the Hawaiian Gazette quotes Schuyler, who had been part of the measuring crew. When that pipe came up, the lava on the other end of it was thick like glue. So here, they are in the early 1900s. They're braving volcanic gases, sulfur dioxide, not a lot of scientific equipment to protect you back then. But here's the Buffalo Soldiers calling to action, getting called into action. It is noted that after they went down into this crater, this is at the summit of Kilauea, a section of where they were standing fell off. One of their guides told them that it was time to go, and a section of the crater actually fell off into the lava lake. Next slide. So they were on Mauna Loa, and it's still active. And here's a picture today of the summit of Kilauea where they took measurements. And these days, geologists do not go into the crater and take samples. But here's the same crater, and almost over 100 years later, and they were in this crater amazingly. So the summit of Kilauea, Halemaumau crater continues today. Reminder, of the work the soldiers were sent in to do when no one else would, resisting segregation along the way. So while on Hawaii Island, these soldiers built a 30-mile trail under grueling conditions, won a baseball game, and suffered through record-breaking weather. Surely it was a one-of-a-kind Hawaiian vacation. The early trail ultimately paved the way for the present Mauna Loa Trail. You can still hike sections of the original path built by these trailblazers in many senses of the word along the northeast rift zone of Mauna Loa today. And over a century later, their handiwork is still visible and guides park visitors through rugged, unforgiving terrain. Next slide. And I'll hand this back over to you, Cristina.
Sounds good. Thank you, Adrian, for sharing, how the Buffalo Soldiers all the way in Hawaii were creating trails. And although Hawaii may not be super accessible to us all, there are still some nearby sites that we can visit, from here, from San Francisco, out in the mountains that have really great history about the Buffalo Soldiers. So after they got back from the Philippine-American War, they were back in the Presidio. So it was very common for Buffalo Soldiers to be dispatched, right, to wherever the U.S. Army intended for them to do. And it was actually in the summer of 1903 where there were 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments, and also the 24th and 25th Infantry that were dispatched to different national parks in the Sierra Nevada. So prior to the existence of the National Park Service, the U.S. Army took on the role of patrolling and managing those newly created parks. And so this map kind of shows you, kind of the journey that the Buffalo Soldiers took on their way to either Yosemite or to Sequoia National Park in the summer of 1903. So it took days. They were on horseback. So it took some time for them to go from here, San Francisco, to Yosemite or Sequoia, which in the present day is probably a 4 to 5 hour drive. It definitely did not take them 4 to 5 hours to go from here, San Francisco, to these beautiful places in the Sierra Nevada. And so patrolling in the Sierra Nevada consisted of driving out domestic sheep and cattle, suppressing fires, and preventing hunting and logging. So one thing to keep in mind about the Sierra Nevada and land use during this time period was the attitudes were changing. Right after the gold rush happened here in California, there was a lot of extraction of land, a lot of activities that were very damaging to the land, from mining, from introduction of invasive species like grasses for cattle themselves, domestic sheep. The beginning of fire suppression began. So there were a lot of ways that the land was not being cared for or attended for, just like, indigenous people have taken care of these places since time immemorial. So once these new parks were created, there were still people, there were still ranchers, other settlers, miners that were still utilizing the Sierra Nevada like they had always done for a couple of decades by this point. So those were some of the challenges that the Buffalo Soldiers had to face. They were patrolling newly formed parks, but they were also coming across, probably resistance from the other side. People that had been doing these activities for so long was now considered illegal in these newly formed parks as well. Next slide. And so, of course, the Buffalo Soldiers, even though they were only in places like Yosemite or Sequoia for just the summer, and that summer of 1903, they did a lot of very significant work. And about 500 Buffalo Soldiers served in both of these parks. This is a photo, and if I'm correct, I believe it's from soldiers from the 24th Infantry in Yosemite National Park. And I really just enjoyed this photo of them just being in the outdoors. So their work in national parks was kind of very different than what they had done in the Spanish-American War, than what they had done in the Philippine-American War a couple of years prior to this. So I will focus a little bit on the work that they did in Sequoia National Park, since I worked there for a couple of seasons. Next slide. So in the summer, in May of 1903, there were about 96 enlisted men of the troops I and M of the 9th Cavalry that were led by Colonel Charles Young to begin that very long journey from San Francisco to the mountainous areas of what is now Sequoia National Park. They did a lot. They accomplished a lot in just that one summer. These soldiers did not return the following summer. So whatever they had to do, they really had to do it in just the span of a couple of months. One thing to consider about being in the Sierra Nevada, you had a very short window to accomplish tasks in those higher elevations. So these soldiers experienced really rugged and very steep terrain. They came across, people like white settlers, ranchers, and cattlers that were probably, not following the rules of a newly formed national park. But they also had to do a lot of manual labor, just like Adrian shared about the construction of the trail that happened in Hawaii. These soldiers also built a lot of infrastructure to help enhance tourism. Because like I mentioned before, attitudes were shifting. A lot of people were no longer looking at the Sierra Nevada as a place to profit from the resources, but they actually wanted to start preserving those areas, visiting those areas, especially those beautiful giant sequoia groves. So the Buffalo Soldiers, one of the biggest accomplishments that they did was the completion of the road to what is called Round Meadow and Morro Rock. If you've been to Sequoia, you know Morro Rock is one of the highlights that all visitors like to check out. And in fact, this road that they constructed to the giant forest is one of the very first roads that gave access to tourists, to many other people, to see these beautiful giant sequoia trees. So really, they were in charge of granting access to others to see those amazing, incredible trees. And in order to celebrate, you know, the completion and the accomplishments that they did from all their hard work, Colonel Charles Young, who was the acting superintendent of Sequoia at the time and the very first Black superintendent of any national park, he had a picnic to celebrate the project's completion. So he did like to acknowledge the very hard work that his soldiers were doing in that summer. And so I always love to mention to visitors that visited Sequoia when I was working there that, you know, enjoying the giant forest and Morro Rock, they all benefit from the foundation and infrastructure the Buffalo Soldiers established during their time in those parks. And this photo here is one of some of the soldiers of the 9th Cavalry. You see Charles Young sitting down right in the center wearing no hat. And there are also photos with some of the white construction workers that also helped them build one of the very first roads into what is now the giant forest, Sequoia Grove. And next slide. And so I like to just briefly touch upon Charles Young. He was an incredible man. His father was an enslaved person that actually ran across state boundaries to gain freedom. And his father also was part of the military. And because his father was in the military, that inspired Charles Young to join the military himself. He was the third African-American man to graduate from West Point Academy. And so his amazing list of accomplishments is something that deserves its own program. But as the first acting superintendent of a place like Sequoia National Park and the first Black superintendent of any national park, I always like to highlight and especially highlight this quote that he wrote about his time in Sequoia during that summer of 1903. Indeed, a journey through this park and the Sierra Forest Reserve to the Mount Whitney country will convince even the least thoughtful man of the needfulness of preserving these mountains just as they are, with their clothing of trees, shrubs, rocks, and vines, and of their importance to the valleys below as reservoirs for storage of water for agricultural and domestic purposes. In this lies the necessity of forest preservation. And so Charles Young, you know, again, incredible person, one of the, you know, few Black men that started rising up the ranks in the military, faced discrimination just like his soldiers were. He was somebody that not only wanted to honor his fellow soldiers, but soldiers wanted to honor him. And so this is a little bit interesting story about how they wanted to honor him in Sequoia National Park after that project of the summer of 1903. Next slide. So soldiers, citizens of the nearby city of Visalia wanted to really acknowledge the work that Charles Young and his soldiers had done in that summer. They had really completed a lot of really hard work, underwent a lot of hard manual labor. And so they actually wanted to honor him by naming a sequoia tree after him. And so this quote says, they wanted to name a tree for a captain, but he refused, saying that they could do so if they felt the same way 20 years hence. So the story goes that Charles Young actually did not want the tree named after him, and that instead, if they wanted to honor somebody else in the Black community, to name a tree after Booker T. Washington. So after that summer of 1903, they dedicated a sequoia tree after Booker T. Washington, since that is who Charles Young thought should get the honor of getting a tree named after him. The story of the Booker T. Washington tree is pretty interesting on its own. In fact, it was kind of a missing story. Nobody really knew where the Booker T. Washington tree was for a good 100 years or so. There wasn't a lot of park documents. There wasn't a lot of information as to where the Booker T. Washington tree was actually located. Some people didn't even think that there was ever a sign dedicated to the Booker T. Washington. And so after a lot of work, after a lot of digging, they were able to find a photograph at the dedication ceremony that the soldiers had. And in the present day, some park staff working along with others, they were able to kind of use that photograph to be able to kind of see in the giant forest if they could locate that tree. One of the main clues that helped them find the Booker T. Washington tree was there was a leaning tree against it. So they were able to find that leaning tree, and they were able to actually find some of the nails on the tree where the original sign was. The sign disappeared over the years because if you've been to the Sierra Nevada during the winter, a lot of these trees, a lot of these areas can have more than 10 feet of snow. So it's very likely that the sign just kind of washed away. And that is why part of that story got lost. But thankfully, with dedication and initiative, and those that wanted to still honor the importance of having this tree be still recognized as a Booker T. Washington tree, especially considering that that is who Charles Young wanted to honor. They had a rededication ceremony in 2003. They invited descendants of Charles Young, and they put up this new sign that you see right in front. However, you know, Charles Young did get his own tree, and that will be in the next slide. Colonel Young has his sequoia tree dedicated after him, and it is located not too far of a walk from the Booker T. Washington tree. So next time you go to Sequoia National Park, I challenge you to try to find these two trees and just say thank you to those people that really were really important, not only for the context of Sequoia National Park history, but for Black military history as well. And another fact I'll mention about the names of the trees in Sequoia National Park is that from all the trees that have names in the giant forest and in the larger park, only 2 trees are named after women, and only 2 trees are named after people of color. And those 2 trees are the Booker T. Washington tree and the Charles Young tree. So I hope the next time you go to Sequoia, I hope that you get to find these trees and say thank you to the very hard work that Charles Young did with his soldiers in the summer of 1903. Next slide. And I just quickly wanted to show you this photo. Sergeant Pierce, pictured here in 1947, was actually with Charles's Young troops in the summer of 1903. And I really just loved finding this photo on the archives because I love that it shows the sequoia tree in the background. And he is holding a photo of himself with his fellow soldiers. So just something that I wanted to share with you all. Next slide. And so we'll kind of bring it home, you know, bring it back to the Presidio of San Francisco. I briefly mentioned that, you know, right before they went to the Philippines, they stopped here in the Presidio of San Francisco. And in fact, you know, they weren't here until 1899. So the garrison here in the Presidio, that's where these Black regiments were. But no battles were actually fought here in the Presidio. This is more where the troops were stationed and then they were dispatched to other places. We are just going to show you a collection of photos. I believe, Sherry, you're going to talk a little bit more about these photos as well.
Yeah, so as Cristina mentioned, you know, members of these regiments, they were stationed at the Presidio. And so we just wanted to share some of the photos that showed you a little bit about their time at the Presidio. So, you know, here you see one on a horse, so likely a cavalry member. And then here is a barber giving someone a nice shave. And this was a photo, or this comes from a postcard that was shared with us from a colleague who used to work at the park and who used to tell the story of the Buffalo Soldiers. So we're very grateful to them for having shared that with us. And then here we see troops I&M escorting President Teddy Roosevelt through the Presidio. And so this was actually the first time that a Black regiment was kind of given sort of like the honor of doing like a presidential escort. And so, you know, just really great photo here that gives you an idea of what that day might have looked like. And then there was also a band. And so, you know, similar to like the 54th Massachusetts, where they had their, you know, their drummer, the Buffalo Soldiers also had bands. And so this is them, you know, going through the Presidio. So you might recognize some of these places. And so another site that is within the park that is also associated with the Buffalo Soldiers is the San Francisco National Cemetery. And so this is the final resting place of over 450 Buffalo Soldiers. And that also includes William H. Tompkin, again, that Medal of Honor recipient that Cristina shared a little bit more about. And another connection that was shared with us was from Rick Penn, who he is the person who shared the postcard with us. And so Rick Penn is, an amazing Buffalo Soldier storyteller. But he shared with us that another person who rests at the cemetery is named Archie Williams. And so Archie Williams was a flight instructor for the Tuskegee Airmen, who, some of you might know, World War II, segregated unit, but who really, were, again, trailblazers, just like these other regiments that we have talked about. And Archie Williams, actually, after his service, he went on to be a teacher. And the school that he taught at was actually just recently renamed. Before it used to be Sir Francis Drake High School, and now it is Archie Williams High School. And so they were also, Archie Williams, was also an Olympic athlete as well. And also just, a really incredible story, and from the area as well. So if you haven't heard about Archie Williams, I definitely encourage you to kind of look into his story. But again, we found just so many connections with people even though we had all worked at different sites. So myself in Boston, Cristina at Sequoia and Kings Canyon, and Adrian over in Hawaii, we found so many connections to the stories that we had talked about in terms of like military history. And so it was really exciting to kind of see all these connections coming up. And so we'll just kind of close it off and let you all know that by telling these non-dominant narratives and stories, stories continue to be sort of relevant today. And so, even though this is Black History Month and we did this presentation, for this month, we just want to remind you all that, Black History Month, it's more than just a month. And, this really is American history, and this really is something that all people should really know about, especially given the widespread impact that the Buffalo Soldiers had on our country. And so I'll kind of hand it off to Adrian and Cristina for any kind of closing remarks.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah. And, as Sherry mentioned, these places and stories are for everybody. And this is a retired Ranger Rick Penn, who volunteered to show us. He used to do talks on the Buffalo Soldiers in the cemetery here. So he came out of retirement to do a talk for us because he knew we were doing this talk. And so African Americans, they make up 13% of the U.S. population, although only make up about 3% of the National Park Service workforce. So just a reminder that no matter, what race we are, it's telling these stories, it's America's story. And there's a saying that if you don't tell the stories, they're lost. And so we, as Rick's now retired, it's who's going to continue to tell these stories. And so we're happy, and we've had fun researching and looking into these stories. And we couldn't cover every site that they worked at, but we covered sites that we have connections to personally as we are park rangers that have worked at. So that was a fun part too. And I'll hand it over to you, Cristina.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Sherry. Again, just kind of echo what you both had said. Everybody should be sharing these stories. Rick mentioned something along the lines of the Buffalo Soldier story is like a wheel with spikes that is extend in all directions. They definitely had a lot of impact. They definitely faced a lot of challenges, but their accomplishments are something to still be talked about, and definitely talking about the legacy in a way that honors them and in a way that kind of acknowledges the realities that they lived during that time period, and how they also served inspiration for not just Black men and women and other individuals in the military, but for people that can connect to those stories. So that's what's important, to tell these non-dominant narratives, which are narratives that tend to be kind of erased purposefully sometimes, narratives that maybe not make it into the mainstream, but definitely should be talked about. And so when we're talking about stories, especially stories that may be forgotten, I just think of that Booker T. Washington tree that kind of was forgotten for a while, and it was until somebody took the initiative to say there is the Booker T. Washington tree. I want you to think about a story at your site or your community that is important to talk about, but a story that tells about a person or a group that fought for their freedom. want you to reflect on that question. Feel free to share in the chat. But we definitely wanted to pose that question to you all, as this question definitely applies a lot to what we talked about with the Buffalo Soldiers, and definitely makes us reflect on what legacies we want to talk about and what legacies we should be talking about.
Yeah, and we'll open it up to questions too. Thanks everybody for hanging late with us on this windy night here. For those of you that are in the San Francisco Bay Area, I know my lights flickered a couple times and we made it to the end. I know one question was, were the Buffalo Soldiers led by white troops or African American troops? And for the most part, I think it was, they had white like colonels, but I think there were some where African Americans were leading, like Charles Young, Colonel Charles Young was leading, but I think they also had like white colonels and things leading them. They weren't allowed to be like colonels of that time frame. Correct me if I'm wrong. Also, Sherry or Christina.
No, you're completely right. It was mostly white officers. There were white military people that were allowed to move up the ranks. So that's why Charles Young is a very important person to talk about, especially considering like his military trajectory and moving up the ranks as one of the very few people that were allowed to do so under the system. I know there was another question about, there's a list of the Buffalo Soldiers. There should be a registry, and Sherry, you might step in. Like, one thing that the U.S. Army is really good at is about keeping records about certain things. But I did share in the chat the list of names of those soldiers from the 4 regiments that are buried in the Presidio. Remember, there's about 450 of them that are buried at the Presidio. The National Cemetery is open to the public from like dusk to dawn, if I'm correct. So definitely a place that you can wander, have, you know, moment of peace, maybe try to say hi to William H. Tompkins' grave. But definitely you can at least see who is buried at the Presidio from those 450 soldiers. And you can actually go to the cemetery, and there's a nice little grave finder really close to the entrance. You can type in people's names and it'll tell you the location, because it's a huge cemetery. If you haven't been there, the grave finder is very useful if you're looking for a particular soldier or a particular person. So I highly encourage you all to check that out in the Presidio.
And somebody asked, how do you understand Bob Marley's song about the Buffalo Soldiers, Jackie? Well, I guess it has many interpretations. One would be, you know, he talks about, that's the name of our talk, is they were fighting on arrival and they were fighting for survival. So they're fighting for their rights. And it talks about, you know, how they were the dreadlock Rastas that came from Africa, and initially, if you think about the history of slavery, and they turned into Buffalo Soldiers fighting for the rights. So it kind of went full circle from, they came from a line of slaves. They were still living under Jim Crow laws in the US. They were still segregated, and they were still fighting for survival, and fighting for their rights even as Buffalo Soldiers. And there's, you know, those are some of the lyrics in that song that I would say speak to how we understand the lyrics and how it relates. And if you know your history, then you'll know where I'm coming from, that the dreadlock Rasta was the Buffalo Soldier. Yeah.
All right, I think that wraps up the questions, right?
One more.
Yeah.
When was the infantry disbanded? Any connection to World War II? I can drop a link in the chat that talks about their involvement in World War I. But I know towards World War II, their involvement severely decreased. I may be wrong, and please step in, Sherry or Adrian. But, you know, according to our website, you know, during the First World War, the size of the United States Army expanded to its greatest number since the Civil War. However, when it came to, you know, Black soldiers, I think there was a dramatic decrease due to racial attitudes and other challenges. So I'll definitely drop the link in the chat, at least when it talks about World War I, because it really kind of sets the precedent for the following World War. Sherry and Adrian, do you have any last words about that questions?
I do not. I think you covered it well. And I did also see a question asking about whether any of Ranger Rick's talks were recorded. And there is a video on YouTube from Ranger Rick talking about the Buffalo Soldiers. So I'll drop that link in the chat. And I also dropped a link for anyone who's interested in doing more of their own research on the Buffalo Soldiers. There is a really great page from the National Archives that kind of gives you an idea on what kind of records are out there.
You ready for me to come back on now? Oh my gosh, that was so great. And as I told you, I knew the links would be flying tonight, and there's no need for our attendees to worry. We got you. Here's tonight's links with all of the links that our amazing presenters shared with us. And I promise I'll send a follow-up email with those links too, so you don't even have to worry about capturing it tonight. But if you did want to, you just click on the 3 dots next to that link and hit copy. And all of the nature boosts have been recorded and preserved and archived on our YouTube channel. And I just looked at it and we have a lot. So you could go back and see all of the nature boosts, all of them as informative as tonight's. Adrian, Sherry, Cristina, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and sharing it with the library community. And library community, thank you so much for showing up tonight. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Come say hi in the Presidio.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Oh, you know, there's so many presentations too we could do from this one. So I'll email you. Bye.